In this tutorial, I'll show you a couple of different watercolor techniques that you can use for your boot camp. First, gather all of your materials. I have a 9x12 piece of watercolor paper that I have folded and created 8 separate sections. I've got a set of watercolor paints, a water bowl, and several different brushes. I'll explain my use for all of the brushes in a moment, but what I want to do first is take a crayon and actually draw on top of the folds I created. The wax from the crayon will help separate your sections so that your paints don't bleed into one another as you do one technique here and another technique in a different box. The first technique I'm going to do is called wet on wet. I'm just going to do that in one of my sections. It really doesn't matter which order you go in, as long as you remember which section you did which technique so you can label them later. Now, wet on wet means that my paper is wet, and of course my watercolors will also be wet. So this particular brush is a little bit stiff, a little bit firm to dig around in my paints. So what I'm going to do is actually just use this brush for my water, to apply the water to my paper. So I'm going to come in here and just to apply the water very liberally to that section. So you don't want major puddles, but you do want to have a good solid surface of water on the paper. You'll notice too, maybe perhaps, that I have taped my paper down. That's to keep it from curling or shifting while I'm working. So then what I can do is add my paints. I'm just going to swirl my pigment. I don't want to dig at my paints. And then I'm just going to drop it on top of that water. And what you'll notice is that the pigment starts to bleed into the water and sort of spread out. Now, if your colors don't appear to be bleeding enough or mixing enough, what you can do is take a squirt bottle of water and just kind of spritz your paper. And you'll notice that you'll see the colors will really start to blend a little bit more fluidly. I would highly recommend keeping your colors to the same sort of family, color family, so you don't end up with a dog barf brown. So this technique, this wet onto wet technique, is really good for backgrounds or large surfaces, just to cover a space to give you some cool kind of different textures and backgrounds within your painting. When you're done painting your wet on wet space, if you notice that you have some pools or puddles that you're kind of not wanting to be there, to just take a dry paper towel and just lightly absorb some of that excess water. If you leave the puddles there, there's nothing wrong with that. Just be careful when you go to pick your painting up that you may end up getting some extra swirls because the pigment will continue to shift as you pick your paper up and carry it to the drying rack. My next technique in my next box is going to be wet on dry, and that is pretty standard for painting with watercolor, and that is basically my paper is dry but my brush and my pigment are wet. So again, swirl your brush around. Don't dig your brush into the paint, but kind of swirl it around. And this is just sort of direct painting, probably similar to what you've done in the past. If I start to run a little dry, see how my pigment's starting to run out, just simply dunk a little bit into your water and swirl back into your paints. So this is, again, a great way to get some wonderful solid colors, but you have more control over how the colors bleed and mix together. So it's not as sort of tie-dye as the wet on wet, but you still get some nice bold colors. Now you'll notice that I just muddied my yellow up pretty good. To clean that out, not a big deal. Make sure your brush is clean. Just kind of swoop out that color until it gets back to its original pigment. So again, this technique is great to cover really large spaces. It allows you to mix some of the colors, but allows you to have a little bit more control over where those colors go versus the wet on wet technique. The next watercolor technique I'll show you is the dry on dry, which sounds kind of strange because we're using watercolors which need water to be hydrated, but what I'm going to do is use the least amount of water I can to hydrate my paints, and I can even use my paper towel to dab some of this extra water off. So this is really good for some thin lines. This is good for leaving texture on top, leaving the texture of the paper really on top. So if you take a look, you see I'm just making some lines here. This is good. You could use this for bark, you could use it for grass, but if you look closely, you can kind of see the texture of the watercolor paper sort of coming through a little bit, which is sort of a nice technique if you're wanting to add just a little bit of pigment and not a ton of color. So again, even though I have more paint on my brush and I'm a little darker here, that's okay. I'm still getting that cool kind of feathery look. Now, of course, you could take multiple colors and add different colors to this to create a little bit more depth, but just to keep this video simple, I'm just going to use one color. I encourage you to definitely go through and try and blend and mix a couple of colors together just to see what it does. All right, the next step is dry on wet. So what I'm going to do is take one of my larger brushes and paint not as wet as a wash, maybe not as dry as the wet on dry, but pretty close. So this is basically, yeah, this is kind of basically my wet on dry. So before I let this actually dry, what I'm going to do is come over here with a brush. And this is very similar to the dry technique now. So I don't have a lot of water on my brush. I'm just taking solid pigment. And you'll notice that the bright colors are showing up and they have soft edges, so they don't bleed as much. So if I want a less fuzzy edge, what I would do is maybe let the blue dry just a little bit longer. But you can see I'm still getting a nice solid color. Still a bright color, just a softer edge. So I have control over where my paint goes, but again, the edges are a little bit fuzzier, a little bit softer. All right, the next technique is just a straight up flat wash. So what that means is I'm not going to really bleed my colors together like I did in my first section, but what I'm going to do is just take one color. I'm going to saturate my paper, and I want to make sure that my paper is wet, but I don't want a bunch of puddles like I had for my wet on wet technique. So because you have to work kind of quickly for this, you want to try and choose a large brush. Now this brush, I said in the beginning, isn't the greatest to use on watercolor because it's a pretty firm bristle, but if you're careful and you don't dig into your paints, it is okay to use. So what I'm trying to accomplish here is to create just one solid tone. I don't want my brush marks or anything to kind of show up on this. I'm trying to create a solid color. So the water is pretty forgiving here. So if you start to see streaks, go ahead and just add a little bit of water. Notice I'm also painting in one direction. So I don't want a bunch of different strokes going a bunch of different directions. Once you think you've accomplished your nice solid color, let it sit to dry. Don't move it around and mess with it. For this next one, I'm going to do a gradual wash or a gradation or a gradient wash or just a fade. And you'll notice what I've done is I've taped my paper to a piece of cardboard because you're going to need to tilt your painting after you get your water on there. You'll see what I mean in a moment. So for this next section, I'm just going to add water to my paper. So again, I want it to be saturated, but I don't want puddles. Okay, then taking my brush, and I'm just going to start at the top. Okay, so I want this nice, solid color up the top, and then I'm going to tip and just start to fade. As you'll notice, I'm starting to run out of paint. I'm not sure if you can see it in the video, but the water is kind of fading and also then dripping to the bottom. So it's a nice way to get a kind of darker color up at the top and then gradually get to a lighter color. So you'll notice that you have 2 spaces left on your paper. Those 2 spaces are for you to explore and experiment and just kind of play around a little bit with some of the techniques we covered and just try a couple of extra things.